without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back Gabor to the stage. Thank you.
So I promised a friend of mine to convey personal greetings to somebody in the audience. And somebody's name is Lisa Moore, known to her big sister Mandy as Wee Bear. And Lisa apparently is the first female principal of the roughest school, they say, in Scotland. So welcome. If you're Lisa, you're here, your sister loves you. Brain development. Now, I'm not talking about the parents' good intentions. I'm not talking about whether the parents love their kids or not. I'm not talking about do the parents do their best. Let me tell you something. Even parents, very often, even parents who by any definition actually abuse their kids, in their own way they love their kids. That just happened to be their best. And that's their best because that's what they were raised. Tragic example of that in Canada, which I'll tell you about in a while. What we're talking about here is the degree of stress that the parents carry and the degree of trauma that the parents, unresolved trauma, not trauma, but unresolved trauma that the parents carry, that gets inevitably passed on to the children. That's what we're talking about. So at the University of, let me give you one example of that, physiologically how that works. At the University of Washington in Seattle, United States, they did an EEG study, electroencephalograms, electrical brainwave studies of 6-month-old infants whose mothers had postpartum depression. And they compared the child's EEG, the electrical printout of the brain's activity, with 6-month-olds whose mothers were not depressed, and you could tell from the child's EEG whose mother was depressed and whose wasn't. In other words, the child's brain circuitry is programmed by the emotional states of the mother. This is pre-verbal. So when you do the ACE studies, this is the limitation of the ACE studies. Not that there's anything wrong with them, but this is one limitation of them. They can't tell you what the mother's emotional state was during pregnancy. They can't tell you what was the mother's emotional state in the first year of the child's life, the first 2 years. And those are the most important times for brain development. So by the time the ACE studies come in, the things that people can actually recall, much of essential brain development has already happened. So what I'm saying is that in a sense, it's more difficult than even the ACE studies would indicate. Because much of what goes on is somewhat prenatal and certainly pre-verbal, for which there's no recall memory. And I'll talk to you about memory later. But let me now talk about mental illness for a while, and I will take questions during this 1 hour period. I showed you, I believe, I attempted to show you that addictions are actually a compensation for some losses. Now, how did these losses accrue, by the way? So given the information I gave you on brain development, what happens when we look at the lives of addicts? So in the downtown east side, in 12 years in Vancouver, I did not meet a single female patient who had not been sexually abused, not one, in 12 years. These people did not blame or try to slough off responsibility. Oh, I was abused and therefore I'm an addict, poor me. They didn't even know the connection. They just thought they were bad people. So it's not that they came to me with this excuse. It's simply when I asked them. And again, if that was only, and the males were similarly abused, often sexually, certainly physically, emotionally. And if this is only my own personal experience, it wouldn't be very interesting, but I don't have to tell this audience that now we have these massive population studies, day studies, and it doesn't matter where you do them, they come up with the same correlations, that the more adversity there is in childhood, the greater the risk of addiction, which of course makes sense. Because the more adversity there is, the more pain you're going to have. It's not why the addiction, but why the pain. Not only that, based on what I just told you, you will understand that the brain itself does not develop the way it should under those adverse conditions. Now, I am not saying that everybody who's traumatized becomes addicted. I'm not saying that. They don't. But addiction is not the only outcome of childhood adversity. Mental illness, autoimmune disease, malignancy, maladaptive behaviors of all kinds. So, I'm not saying that everybody who's traumatized becomes addicted. I am saying that everybody who's addicted was traumatized. And now there may be some of you in the audience who might be saying to yourself, well, I had a perfectly happy childhood and I still have an addiction problem. Usually that takes me 3 minutes. It's what I call the Happy Childhood Challenge. If anybody thinks they had a happy childhood and they became addicted anyway or developed mental illness anyway, and if you want to find out just how miserable your childhood actually was, just put your hand up and talk to me. It takes only a few questions. And I'm not joking, really. Because what happens is that whatever happens to you, you think is normal. You have nothing to compare it to. And not only that, the human mind has ways of dealing with all that pain, which is to suppress the pain. So while your happy memories might be quite accurate, you don't remember the unhappy ones. I'm making a general statement. I cannot possibly prove it to you, but I can certainly demonstrate it by anybody who wants to talk to me about it. But to come back to my original point, I'm not talking about bad parenting here. I'm not pointing the finger of blame at parents. I was a traumatized child, and when I became an adult and a parent, I was far from having worked out my trauma. I did pass it on to my kids. Not because I wanted to. And by the way, I got bad news for you. We always marry somebody exactly at the same level of trauma that we're at. It's an iron law. There are no exceptions. Don't come in and tell me, oh, my husband is so traumatized. I don't know what to do about it. Or you're my wife, or my spouse, partner. Because I'll say to you, you're at the same level of trauma, otherwise you wouldn't be with them. Which means that usually, people at the same level of trauma, which they haven't resolved yet, are now raising kids. And guess what? Inevitably, and unknowingly, and unwittingly, and unconsciously, and completely non-deliberately, they passed it on to their kids. Now, I told you that I was diagnosed with ADD in my 50s, and the hallmark, of course, is the automatic tuning out, the absent-mindedness, difficulty staying present to what was going on. And this was considered to be a disease, and I didn't know anything about brain development. That information had not crossed my path yet, but I knew that the disease model didn't work. It wasn't accurate. Why did I know that? Because I knew that tuning out, absent-mindedness, dissociation, is not a disease. Not a disease. What is it actually? It's a coping mechanism. It's an automatic coping mechanism of the human brain. When is it invoked? It's invoked when a person... See, if I were to stress you right now, what options would you have? You could leave, That's called flight. You could assert yourself and tell me to shut up. That'd be fight. And if you couldn't do either, because I was that much more powerful, but there were 1,900 people here in the room with you, you could ask for help. But if you were stressed, and there was no help for you, and you couldn't fight back or escape, then what would you do? You wouldn't do anything. Your brain would do it for you. You would dissociate as one of the defenses so that the suffering wouldn't be so unbearable. So it's a coping mechanism. So I knew that ADD was not a disease. It was a coping mechanism. What I didn't know, and found out only almost by accident, was the information on brain development that I gave you. So, those of you that know my personal history, a Jewish infant in Hungary, 1944, under the Nazis. I spent my first year in the Nazi occupation with my grandparents being sent to Auschwitz and my mother and I barely surviving in the ghetto of Budapest, my father away in forced labor. What was her state of mind? And therefore, what was my state of mind? Now I'm going to read you a quote here. The child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he is with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. The organism does not develop the confidence that it can regulate itself, that things will happen the way they should. If the pain and frustration continue, they will have a disintegrating effect on the organism, and the child will experience organismic fear for its very survival. How do you deal with all that? As a 2-month-old, as a 6-month-old, you dissociate. When are you dissociating? When your brain is developing. And that dissociation now becomes wired into your brain. And 50 years later, you're diagnosed with this so-called disease, which began as a coping mechanism. Now, if you look at, say, ADHD, there's no other explanation for it. This whole idea that it's a genetic disorder is nonsense. Because if it was genetic, why is it increasing so much in Western society? Genes don't change in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years. It's because parenting has become so stressed. And kids are picking up on this. Sensitive kids, genetically sensitive kids, they're not wired for ADHD, they're just sensitive, which means they're more affected by the environment. That means that they have more of a need to dissociate, for example, or develop other brain defenses, which I'll talk about in a moment. Well, what I'm saying to you is fundamentally mental illness begins as a coping mechanism during the period of brain development in the early years, and later on those coping mechanisms become problems, which we then diagnose as diseases. Now, I thought so for a long time. Now I'm going to give you, so my first book was actually on ADHD, Scattered Minds. But then you go back to this article from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child that I quoted to you before. And what do they say in their abstract? Here's what they say. Growing scientific evidence demonstrates that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity, stress, or instability, and by the way, poverty should be listed as one of the adverse childhood experiences. We know what poverty does to the child's brain. Growing scientific evidence demonstrates that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity, stress, or instability can lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. So says the American Pediatric Association Journal of Pediatrics from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child in 2012. In other words, the way kids cope with early adversity helps them endure those intolerable times, and those same coping mechanisms become sources of what we call pathology later on. And there, in a nutshell, you have mental illness, and that's the relationship between ACEs and mental illness. Because under those conditions, and parental stress in general, why are so many more kids being diagnosed with every manner of disorder? Do you guys have this so-called diagnosis called oppositional defiant disorder in North America? Oh, sorry, in Britain? Yeah. You know what? It doesn't even exist. There's no such thing as oppositional defiant disorder, which I'll prove to you in a few minutes. These diagnoses describe things. They describe them rather accurately. If you give me a printout of the traits of the ADD mind and psychology and personality, that's me. It describes me. But it doesn't explain anything about me. It doesn't explain why I develop those traits. So diagnoses can be helpful in that they describe something and then they give us a way towards approaching that particular person, but they don't explain anything. So depression, you might say to me, well, how does depression become a coping mechanism? Well, it's in the word itself. What does it mean to depress? It means to push down. Now, let's say you have a 2-year-old. And the 2-year-old wants another cookie before dinner. And you don't give it to them. Well, what does a human being do when they're frustrated? A 2-year-old, by the way, doesn't know the difference between a need and a desire. A 2-year-old doesn't know the difference. Many adults don't know the difference. I need it. You don't need it. You want it. It's not the same thing. But the 2-year-old throws a tantrum. What are then we taught to do with the 2-year-old with the tantrum? Well, as I said earlier, in North America, the teaching is you give them a timeout. Now, what's the timeout mean? Timeout means that you're saying to the kid, the parent doesn't know this, the parent just wants the kid to behave. But what are we actually doing? We're saying to the 2-year-old, kid, I know exactly what your biggest need is, and that's your attachment relationship with me, without which you cannot survive. Therefore, I know what your biggest fear is. Your biggest fear is the loss of that attachment relationship. And guess what, kid? Should you displease me, I'm going to threaten you with your worst fear. And we think we bring up healthy kids this way. What we're actually doing is we're stressing the kids' brains. They have high levels of cortisol, and under conditions of high cortisol, important brain structures do not develop. So we don't even parent the way we need to parent. And parents are taught to be this way. Or even worse, or not even worse, but equally. In North America, at least, we have what's called sleep training. We're training kids to sleep. How do we do that? By not picking them up when they're crying at night. Now, why is the kid crying? The kid's crying because they might be hungry or uncomfortable, but that's fine. We're not torturers. We're told by the doctors and the sleep training nurses to check if the kid needs feeding or changing and do that. But if they're just crying because they want attention and contact with you, don't pick them up and then they'll go back to sleep. And you know what? I used to advocate this when I did a lot of babies as a family physician. Blithely, I used to tell parents to do this, not knowing what harm I was doing. Because why is the kid crying? Because they have a need. The only way to signal that need is crying. And what we're saying to parents is, ignore the child's biggest need. Guess what? The kid after 3 nights goes back to sleep. It works. Why does the kid go back to sleep? Because they give up. is too painful. Their brain's supposed to sleep so they don't have to be there for that suffering. And what have you taught them? And what have you done to their brain development? Now, there's so much I want to tell you. Dr. Darcia Narvaez from Notre Dame University, who you must invite here sometime, studied the optimal parenting environment. And she found that the optimal parenting environment is actually the hunter-gatherer tribe. Now, there's a number of features in the hunter-gatherer tribe that are very distinct from the way that we parent. In the hunter-gatherer tribe, which is a group of about 50 to 80 to maybe 100 people, kids are brought up by all the adults. So children have multiple adult relationships, not just this single father or mother or this isolated family unit, nuclear family unit, but the entire tribe. So children are very secure. And there's a wonderful book called Children of the Forest, by a British writer about the pygmies, about the pygmies raise the kids in their natural environment as a group. That's the fun. So there's multiple safe attachments for these kids. That's the first thing. The second thing is Aboriginal people don't hit their kids usually. They don't hit their kids. Now let me tell you an interesting fact. When the pilgrims from Britain, or England in those days, came to North America, these Christians, they were appalled by the parenting practices of the natives. This was recorded at the time. Why were they appalled? Because the natives didn't hit their kids. And to the Christians, reared in the gentle spirit of Jesus, not hitting kids was a mistake. Spare the rod, spoil the child. So they didn't hit their kids. So the kids did not have to be afraid of the adults around them. Thirdly, they didn't let their kids cry. As soon as the kid cried, they would pick them up. In fact, they never even put them down. In the Iroquois, I think it was a Sioux elder told me in Canada, a native elder told me that in our tribe, kids don't even touch the ground for 2 years. They're always being held by somebody. And if they cry, certainly they're picked up immediately. So these are now here's the problem for us today in modern civilization, is that if human evolution began at this wall over here, and there have been human beings on Earth for hundreds of thousands of years, not our species, but various human types, and if human evolution began, 2.5 million years ago when we first departed, I think, from our ape-like common ancestor that we shared with our ape relatives, for 2.5 million years and for hundreds of thousands of years of human existence, if that begins at that wall over there, and if our present time is this wall over here, then until this long ago, we lived in hunter-gatherer tribes. Right. In other words, what we call human nature evolved in a setting entirely different in which we live now. So now we have a society in which, never mind multiple parents and community parenting, even the biological parents often don't see the kid the whole day. It's completely unnatural. Now, I'm not advocating going back to hunter-gatherer days, by the way. I'm only saying what we've lost, and we have to be aware of what we've lost. And what we've lost is attachment. And why do we have to be aware of it? Well, I talked about gravity. The reason you're fairly certain that I'm not going to fly off towards the ceiling is because the force of gravity is pulling me towards the earth. That's the attachment force. I don't have to think about gravity. Sir Isaac Newton discovered its workings, but he didn't have to worry about it because he was going to walk on the ground. He wasn't going to float off to the ceiling. Well, what if we landed on the moon all of a sudden? What if you're sent on a mission to the moon? where the gravitational force is much less than that of the Earth. Now you have to be very conscious of gravity. Because if you weren't conscious of it, you couldn't compensate for it. And if you didn't compensate for it, you couldn't survive on the moon. You have to have heavy boots, for example. That's what's happened to us. That gravitational force of attachment that worked naturally in the context of the hunter-gatherer tribe has been completely or almost completely lost to us. Now we have to compensate for it. Now we have to study it. Now we have to be aware of it. Because most of us were no longer raised in ways that promoted fully healthy attachments. And I'll talk about some of the implications. But to go back to that 2-year-old then who was crying because they didn't get the cookie, and we give them a timeout. Well, pretty soon we give the child the message that good little kids don't get angry. That's not the message the child receives. The message the child receives is angry little kids don't get loved. And what's the child's option? The child can stay angry and then threaten the attachment relationship without which he can't live, or he can push down his anger, he can depress it. Guess what anger is? Sorry, guess what depression is? Most people who are depressed are pushing down their healthy anger. If you've ever been depressed, you know this. Now, does depression involve brain chemicals? Of course it does. My basic orientation individually is a depressive. And the first time I took an antidepressant was in my 40s. And it didn't take 3 weeks or 6 weeks to work, it took 2 days. And within 2 days I said to my sister-in-law, you mean people feel like this normally? Clearly there's something chemical going on in my brain. But what happened to my brain in my early years? That serotonin circuit, those oxytocin circuits, didn't develop properly because of the conditions under which I spent, particularly my first 1.5 years of life. So it's not a question of is this psychology versus physiology. It's a question that it's all one unit. But it does become as a coping mechanism. ADHD becomes a coping mechanism, depression does, anxiety does. Because anxiety, what is anxiety about? And by the way, anxiety is the fastest growing diagnosis in North America right now. Probably here as well. What is anxiety about in the beginning? Anxiety is the fear of losing something that you need. And when you're anxious, you cry. And when you cry, the world is supposed to come and take care of you. But what if in this crazy world of ours, in this denatured world of ours, the parents no longer know how to take care of you because of their own stresses and traumas, and because of the economic pressure they're under, and because of the psychological issues that they have? Well, then the anxiety becomes endemic in you. It just becomes rooted in you. And now you're anxious. But it just began as a fear of loss of attachment, which is good that you should have that fear, because that kept you close to your parents. Psychosis. It's interesting about psychosis. These studies, by the way, also show an increased risk of psychosis, depending on childhood adversity. And despite that fact, according to studies that I've seen, when people, and I for 1.5 years, I worked as the family practice consultant to a psychiatric department in one of the major hospitals in Vancouver. People were never asked about their childhoods. And that's what the study shows well. And last fall or summer, I became involved in a criminal case. I was asked to give an opinion. I'm not going to go into all the details. 3 psychiatrists that interviewed this guy. 3 forensic psychiatrists, 4.5 hours each, 4 hours for each interview. They all reported that he had a happy childhood. I talked to him for 45 minutes. One of the psychiatrists actually noted that the prisoner said that his father drank a fair bit, or drank a decent amount, that's how he put it. He just noted that the prisoner or the defendant said that his father drank a decent amount, but never asked any other questions. So I talked to this guy for 45 minutes. He said he had a happy childhood. I said, okay, how much did your father drink? Oh, every day. And what was he like when he drank? He yelled a lot. What's that like for a 3-year-old? And how does your mother feel about it? Oh, she was very upset about it. His brother broke his arm when he was 4 years old and set fire to his hair. His father was an alcoholic. He was bullied in school. And this was the happy childhood that 3 psychiatrists reported in their forensic report. And I'm not blaming these people. They're dedicated professionals. It's just that we're ignoring the obvious. We become unconscious of attachment. And we become unconscious of the insults that attachment losses impose on human development. Now, psychosis? Well, let's say I believe that the Martians, I was going to say, let's say I believe that the federal government is spying on me. But these days, that's not so paranoid. I mean, that's just realistic thinking. But let's say I believe that Martians are spying on me with a view of controlling me for hostile purposes. So I'm psychotic. I got this delusional belief. But what if that delusional belief actually reflects my emotional experiences as a child? What if I felt small and helpless and controlled by creatures who made me suffer? And what if that psychotic belief is a way of escaping from the pain of not having been loved the way I wanted to be loved? Now, I'm not saying there's nothing going on the brain physiological level. Of course there is. But one more time, the two can't be separated. I'm going to talk about one more dynamic and then take 10 minutes for questions. I talked about the importance of the tribe in raising the child, and I talked about the importance of attachment. Now, attachment is important for birds. Birds already don't survive without attachment relationships, so they're biologically wired for attachment. So, the duckling hatches from the egg and sees the mother duck, and then you know what that process is called? It's called imprinting. When the duckling says to himself, okay, this is the creature that's going to protect me, nurture me, she's going to be my mentor and my defender and my model until I become an adult duck. That's what imprinting means. And it's an attachment dynamic. Now, it's well known what happens, though, if the duckling hatches and the mother duck is not there. The duck still imprints, but on who? Anybody know? Anything that moves. Could be a horse, a dog, or a mechanical moving toy. Because the duck's brain is wired for attachment. It's biologically wired for attachment. But it's not wired to attach to any one particular creature. A human brain is also wired to attach. But we're not wired to attach to mom and dad. Now, why are we not wired to attach to mom and dad? Because mom and dad may die. So then what? Now, in the hunter-gatherer tribe, when there's multiple adult attachment figures, mom and dad may die, but the child is already in a safe network of attachments. What happens in our society is our children are still wired to attach, but nothing in their brain tells them who to attach to. That's the job of the culture, to provide the right attachments. And the human brain can't handle what we call an attachment void. An attachment void is when there's no attachment figure and you're a dependent person. Your brain can't handle an attachment void. So it has to fill it with somebody, just like the duckling fills it with that horse. So when young kids are separated from their parents at an early age, for example, they sent to daycare, they have an attachment void. Who will they fill it with? With whoever's around. And who do most of our kids in our culture spend most of their time these days? With other kids. And now their attachment dynamics become transferred to the peer group. Now they become peer attached. And the problem with peer attachment is they become peer oriented, which means we get our orientation, our sense of direction, how to be, how to walk, how to talk, from the people that we're attached to. Now they're getting all that from their peers. And you can see the impacts of that in the teenage gangs, and you can see it on the internet, where people go on Facebook, where they have attachment needs that are being pseudo-met. Because what happens on Facebook? People have friends. People like each other. It's completely phony because nobody knows their real self. Nobody sees their real self. It's the desperation to meet their attachment needs through the peer group. And that's a disaster for child rearing. It's a disaster for education because we learn from the people that we're looking to for attachment. So the teacher may be the best trained pedagogue and with the greatest information. If the kids are not looking to her, they're going to learn nothing from her. So in order to educate kids, we have to attach them to us. That's why I'm saying that education is not about the conveyance of information. It's about the promotion of the human brain development by providing healthy relationships. And discipline, we think that discipline has to do with punishment. No, it doesn't. What's a disciple? Disciple is somebody who follows you. Why do they follow you? Because they love you. Jesus had disciples, not because he threatened them, but because they loved them. And those teachers that get it, they have such a good time in the classroom and they're so effective. But they're not educated in this. Again, attachment is not really taught, as far as I know, in faculties of education. Yet it's the most important dynamic. So this peer orientation completely undermines child development. Now, let me give you an example. And by the way, when it comes to addiction, in what context do most people first meet their addictive substances? In the peer group. There's no point, there's no point telling kids not to use drugs if they're not looking to us. If it's more important to them to fit in with the peer group than with us, they're going to ignore it and laugh at the information we give them. The way you prevent addiction is by maintaining healthy relationships with kids. Now they'll listen to you when you talk to them about drugs or anything else. And if you don't have that relationship because they're too ensconced and too focused on the peer group, it's like throwing beans at a wall, as they say in Hungarian. It just won't stick. And so attachment is meant to serve healthy parenting, because the attachment is meant to make the child heed you, follow you, listen to you. But when attachment works against you, when the child starts orienting to the peer group, all you can do is increase the pressure. When you lose your natural authority, which comes from the child's relationship to you, now you become authoritarian, which is not the same thing. There's a huge difference between authoritative and authoritarian. And many of the parenting practices that are advocated these days are authoritarian. Either permissive, which is not good, or authoritarian, which is also not good, rather than authoritative. And now we come to this so-called diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder. Let me give you an illustration. Would you mind standing up here for a minute? So I'm going to come down here for a sec. So if you put your hand out, I push on you. So what do you do as soon as I push on your hand? You resist. You push back. Okay. So you push back. You opposed what I was doing, right? This man has oppositional defiant disorder because he was opposing what I was doing. But did you notice something? There was a relationship here. He was only pushing back because I was pushing him in first. Why do we diagnose the kid instead of looking at the relationship? When kids become peer-oriented, it seems totally unnatural to them that parents and other adults should be telling them what to do. Or they push back. That's natural. And now we diagnose them with oppositional defiant disorder, which is nonsense. Because if my foot was broken, or if I had a flu, would it make any difference to me whether the 1,900 of you were here in the room with me or if I was by myself? No, my foot would be just as broken. My flu would be just as rabid. But could I oppose you if you weren't here? If you know what I'm talking about, go back to your home this evening, shut yourself in a room by yourself, make sure there's nobody else there, and oppose somebody. And if you manage to do it successfully, put it on YouTube, for God's sakes. We want to see how you do it. Oppositionality, by definition, implies a relationship. Instead of diagnosing the kid, why don't we look at the state of the relationship? And let me come back here to something that Harry Burns said in his TED Talk, and also last night on the news program. We talk about kids acting out. Do you use that phrase here? Acting out? To denote bad behavior? Yes? Okay. That's not what it means. Acting out doesn't mean being angry or destructive or oppositional or arrogant or rude or any of that stuff. Acting out means that you're portraying behavior something you haven't got the words to say in language. In the game of charades, we're not allowed to speak. What do you have to do? You have to act out. Yes, kids are acting out. They're acting out their emotional dynamics. They're acting out their loss of attachment. They're acting out their frustrations because their needs aren't being met. What is their biggest need? Healthy attachments with adults. And that's what these kids are acting out. And what do? We punish them for it. We exclude them for it. We ostracize them for it. In other words, we do to them what we then later do to the adult addict, is we deprive them of human relationship. And we think this is the way to bring up human beings. The bit I just told you about, peer orientation and its devastating impact on parenting and how to reverse it, and in education as well, is in the book, Hold On To Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers, which I wrote with the brilliant man whose theory I've just given you. His name is Gordon Neufeld, and he's, to my mind, the world's leading developmental psychologist. We have 7.5 minutes. I'd like to pause here for any questions. I know I've said a lot, but I hope to answer some of your questions. There'll be more time for questions later. My problem is I have way too much to tell you. And I'm going to make a request. First of all, I have a hearing problem. I don't hear well. And the second problem is that you guys don't speak well. So I really ask you to speak slowly so I can understand what you're asking me. Okay, now how is this going to work? The mics, are the mics somewhere? You got a mic? Okay, so just give it to anybody. Yeah.
What questions do you ask in the Happy Childhood Challenge?
Yeah. What about it?
What questions do you ask? You said you could do it.
Does anybody here believe they had a happy childhood? That they want to talk to me about it? Anybody? Any takers or no? Yeah. Well, if you have, come on up here to the front, would you? If you're willing to. Great. We have a. Would you mind coming on stage? Thank you. Hi. What's your name? She needs a mic. Julia needs a mic. Yeah, thank you. Oh, yeah. Did you say Jillian? Hi, well, thanks for coming up, and please hold the mic close to your mouth. Okay?
Jillian.
Yeah, thank you. So, thanks for doing this. And if you're not comfortable with anything I ask you, just...
No problem.
Okay, yeah. So the first thing is you had some mental health or addiction issue at some point in your life, yeah?
Yeah.
I don't need to know what it was or when, it doesn't matter. Okay, but you had a happy childhood.
Yes.
Well, please tell me about your happy childhood.
I've got a mum and dad who are still together today. They were both school teachers. My dad's always been really passionate in looking at the curriculum for kids, and my dad's the guy.
Okay, here's what I do. I interrupt a lot, okay?
Yeah.
The first thing I notice is you haven't even begun to answer my question.
Okay.
You began to talk about your parents,
Sure.
which tells me that your focus is external rather than internal. Is that right?
Yeah.
You get other people more than yourself. Tell me about your happy childhood, not about what your parents did or who they were. Hold the mic close to you. And by the way, I know you're probably nervous and
Sure.
it's a bit difficult.
We've
There's only 1,900 people here.
I think I always knew I was loved as a kid. I was always, I'd never worry about food or, being looked after. We'd go on great holidays. I had a little brother and a little sister.
Okay. So, obvious questions, nobody ever sexually abused you?
No,
Not inside the family, not outside the family?
no,
Okay. Your parents didn't drink?
no,
Not at
very minimally.
But that was never a problem.
No.
Your parents didn't fight?
No, not significantly, no. Everybody fights a little.
So your parents fought? So I want to know, take me inside the scene when they were fighting. What would you see? What would I hear? If I was a fly on the wall, what would I notice?
Apparently, when I was a little girl, one of the first things I said was, "Don't force her, dear."
Did they say what?
When I was a little girl,
Yeah.
one of the first things I said was, "Don't force her, dear," which was me, I think, picking up on my mum and dad's anxiety about bringing up this kid.
So, whose anxiety are you talking about?
What's that?
When you said, don't divorce her, dear, is that what you said?
Don't force her, dear.
Don't force her.
Yeah.
Who said this?
It must have been like my mum saying to my dad when they were trying to bring up this baby that they maybe didn't know what to do with.
Okay, but again, if I was to witness an episode of them fighting, what would I say? Loud voices or no?
Yeah,
How loud?
not very loud.
Okay. And do you have kids?
Do I have kids?
Yeah.
No.
How would you have been when you first heard this loud voice that you say?
How was I what?
How old would you have been when you first heard loud voices?
Well, I must have been, maybe 1 or 2 when
One
I
or
was
two, okay.
first.
Do you know any 1-year-olds?
Do I?
Know any 1-year-olds?
No, not many.
Have you seen any 1 or 2-year-olds? Have you ever, anybody, any relative, any friend, anybody ever?
Yeah, I've been around babies a wee bit.
Okay, all right. How does a 1-year-old feel when they hear yelling?
They get anxious.
Uh-huh. Were you ever unhappy or anxious as a kid?
Is that-
Were you ever unhappy or sad or anxious as a child?
Yes, probably.
I'm asking-
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And who did you speak to about it?
Nobody. I expected people to read my mind and understand how unhappy I was.
All right. If you had a 5-year-old who was anxious,
Yes.
who would you want her to talk to?
Probably the mum or the dad. Or
If you're the mom, who would you want your child to talk to?
me.
Okay. If your 5-year-old was anxious and she didn't talk to you, why would you want her to talk to you, by the way?
Because then hopefully I could help and reassure her.
And If your 5-year-old was anxious and she didn't talk to you, how would you explain that?
I would be hurt.
I'm not asking how you feel about it. I'm asking how you explain it, why she's not talking to you.
I guess I would see my kids demonstrating the behaviours that maybe I had shown or something.
Yeah, but what's happening for them that they're not talking to you?
They're pushing down
They're pushing down their feelings.
the feelings.
They don't trust you enough. What's it like for a kid not to trust their mother at age 5?
That's scary.
That's your childhood. Okay. Now, how you dealt with it is you pushed it down.
Yeah.
Okay. All you have to do is imagine another kid in that same situation, and you see it right away. Okay. Ever bullied in school?
Yeah, later on.
And who did you talk to about it?
Nobody.
Okay. And if your kid was bullied in school, who would you want them to talk to? If your child was bullied in school, who would you want them to talk to?
Anybody, a teacher, a friend.
Or you as the parent? What does it feel like for a child to have nobody to talk to? What's it like to feel? What's it feel like to be bullied?
Very painful and very lonely.
Very painful and lonely. And you talk to nobody about it.
Yeah.
Now, on the first day of your life, if you felt lonely, do you think you kept it in or do you think you cried?
I'd keep it in.
On the first day of your life?
Sorry, cry, yeah.
You cried. What about the second day of your life?
What's that?
On the second day of life, you felt lonely or in pain. Do you think you'd cry or do you think you'd keep it in?
I think I'd cry.
Sure you would. And today, if you feel lonely and in pain, what do you do with it?
Now I cry, but
And do you ask for help?
yeah, I ask for help, and I've been very lucky to get help.
Excellent. And what would it be like today for you as an adult to have nobody to ask for help from? What would that be like for you today? Not as a 3-year-old, not as a 5-year-old, as you now. What would that be like for you?
Very isolating and very sad.
Now imagine that for a small child, okay?
Yeah.
And there's your childhood.
Yeah.
Okay? Thank you. And that's it. I think that's it for now for the lunch break. Is that right? So I'll let my friend Gary take over.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Gabor Maté.